Well, Ukraine has been demanding fighter jets for months and is finally starting to get some. Poland and Slovakia are handing over their Soviet-era MiG-29s. Let's find out more about these aircraft.
This is a Slovakian MiG-29, the model that was once the pride of the Soviet Union's Air Force, on its way to Ukraine last month. The MiG-29 came into service in 1983, at the time a rival to US-built F-16s, a product of the race to rule the skies during the Cold War. Ukrainian pilots are already trained to fly the planes, so in theory, they're ready to go. On paper, the MiG-29 looks impressive. It can max out at 2,400 kilometers per hour. Its range is over 2,000 kilometers, and it can fly up to 18 kilometers altitude. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says he's thankful, but that Ukraine needs much more. I'm grateful to Poland and I'm grateful to Slovakia for their decisions on MiGs for Ukraine. This will significantly strengthen the defense of our sky. But we need modern aircraft. And this is exactly what we've been saying. Is there a rational motivation for the delay in providing modern aircraft? The word modern is the key here. Russia has been using a range of attack aircraft in Ukraine, some developed decades after the MiG-29. To top that off, many of the Polish and Slovak planes headed to Ukraine now are in bad condition. They may end up being used to provide parts to repair Ukraine's existing air force. Kyiv has previously called for a fighter jet coalition for Ukraine, which would use newer planes made by different NATO countries. That may still come, but for now, the MiG-29s will have to do.
So let's get more on that. We're joined now by Mike Martin, Senior Fellow in War Studies at King's College London. Mike, when you look at it practically, what difference are the MiGs likely to make in the war?
So things like fighter jets are not decisive in a war like the kind of war that we're seeing in Ukraine. What we're going to see from the Ukrainians over the next few months is a large ground offensive. And what fighter jets do, the role that they play in that, is they enable the Ukrainians to hit targets, command logistics behind the front of the Russian lines, which enables that ground offensive to get away more easily. So that's the role that they play.
So what do you make of the commitments that you have been seeing from Ukraine's Western partners then? And also, you know, what you've been making of what Ukraine wants, which is F-16s right now?
Yeah, so I was actually totting up yesterday and this morning the weapons deliveries that Ukraine's received over the last year. And they're looking at over 300 tanks that they have either had pledged or received, and several hundred infantry fighting vehicles, as well as air defense and engineer assets and all the rest of it. And what that looks like to me is about 2 divisions, one of tanks and one of armored infantry, and then further divisions of mechanized infantry. So Ukraine, it seems to me, has got a good force together for the counteroffensive, which we all know is coming in the next days or weeks. The next level, as I said in my previous answer, is to get some air cover, or to improve its air cover, because it has some helicopters, which enables it to hit targets in the Russian rear, which enables that ground offensive to get underway. So the reason Ukrainians are asking for it is because this is the next level of capability that they need to smooth that offensive.
Do you think they'll get it? Because, I mean, we're hearing that the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, that those 54 countries supporting Ukraine will meet later today. What do you think most realistically will come out of that?
I think, and we've seen this split throughout the war, I think the big donors, so America obviously is the biggest, the second biggest is the United Kingdom, are going to be slightly reticent. Firstly, because they don't have Soviet-era equipment to give over. And secondly, because they're slightly worried about providing Ukraine with capabilities that they can use to hit, say, Belgorod in Russia. The other countries that are in the contact group, so in the Baltics, or you just mentioned Poland as well, those guys are, A, much nearer to Russia, and B, less worried about Ukraine using these weapons to strike targets inside Russia. And so we might see some further deliveries of fighter jets from countries like Estonia or Latvia or Poland, but probably very unlikely to come from the US and the UK.
Mike, we've been hearing a lot about a so-called planned spring offensive coming up. And, you know, when you look at the situation right now, how do you see Ukraine's chances going into that?
Well, the big problem that the Ukrainians have to solve is that the most obvious area for their offensive, which is going south from Zaporizhia to get to the coast of the Sea of Azov, thus splitting the Russian forces in two, is also the area where the Russians have built 2 or 3 or 4 defensive lines, so anti-tank ditches and concrete pillboxes and so on and so forth. So the Ukrainians need to be quite clever about how and where they assault. And that is, of course, the big question, whether they'll attempt maybe a river crossing in the Kherson region, or whether they'll try to cut the Russian supply lines over the other side of the war in the northeast.
Mike, I'd like to ask you just briefly before we go. Ukraine wants NATO membership. That seems to be far away because there's an ongoing conflict there, and that conflicts actually with NATO's mandate. How do you think, we've been talking also about the Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg being in Ukraine, this surprise visit that he's just made. How do you think that is being interpreted in Ukraine? How do you think it should be interpreted?
So I think Jens Stoltenberg's visit to Ukraine is much of a muchness with the visits of other world leaders that we've seen to Ukraine. It's just to underscore the point that Ukraine has the support of basically the rich nations of the world, apart from China. On NATO membership, this is not going to happen while the war's going on. Firstly, because NATO can't have countries at war acceding to it because it triggers Article 5 and thus draws in all the troops of all the NATO countries. And secondly, and probably more importantly, eventually the fighting is going to stop, and then we are going to start talking. And when we start talking, what happens with Ukraine and NATO is going to be a key thing that's up for discussion.
Mike Martin, Senior Fellow of War Studies at King's College in London. Thank you so much.